Cale measured his breathing in 6-second intervals, 3 seconds inhaling through his nose, 3 seconds exhaling through his mouth. The rhythm kept his core temperature stable during the morning shift when the outer dome's heating systems cycled offline for maintenance. Around him, newer laborers wrapped their torsos in thermal blankets and worked in stuttering bursts, their productivity graphs dipping each time the temperature dropped below regulation. He kept his movement steady, his hands bare, his focus on the soil composition readings that didn't require interpretation, just documentation. The work required no thought. That was the point. His previous position in environmental calibration had demanded constant decision-making, adjusting atmospheric ratios, predicting system failures, coordinating with 6 other departments to maintain the colony's delicate equilibrium. The tribunal had stripped that from him 3 years ago, along with his residential assignment, his meal allocation tier, and his designated reproductive pairing. The demotion paperwork listed his new function as agricultural maintenance technician, which translated to manual labor in conditions where most workers cycled out after 18 months due to medical complications. He was beginning his 37th month. The soil sampler beeped, indicating completion. Cale transferred the data to his wrist display without reading it. Someone in the central analysis hub would generate reports he'd never see, making decisions about crop rotation and nutrient supplementation that would arrive as updated protocols on his next shift assignment. His role was collection, not interpretation. The system had made that distinction clear. He moved to the next plot, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the cultivated rows. The dome's transparent panels filtered the morning sun into diffused light that made everything appear slightly washed out, colors muted to functional grayscale. He'd stopped noticing the aesthetic degradation after the first year. Beauty was a resource allocation the outer domes couldn't justify. His wrist display pulsed with an incoming message, not a work directive. Those arrived through the overhead system with audible alerts. Personal communications were rare enough that the haptic feedback felt unfamiliar against his skin. Report to Medical Research Complex, Sub-Level 3, 14 SO. Mandatory assessment. Non-compliance will result in protocol enforcement. Cale read it twice, his breathing rhythm unchanged. Medical assessments occurred quarterly for outer dome workers, screening for the radiation damage and respiratory degradation that justified the hazard compensation. But his last assessment had been 5 weeks ago, and the location was wrong. Routine screenings happened in the satellite clinics attached to each dome sector, not in the central research complex. He archived the message and returned to his sampling routine. Whatever the research division wanted, it wouldn't change the soil composition in Plot 7 Delta. The research complex occupied the colony's central hub, 3 levels below the residential sectors, where temperature control and atmospheric purity were maintained at optimal ranges. Cale felt the difference the moment he stepped through the access corridor. The air cleaner, cooler, carrying the faint metallic scent of sterilization protocols. His skin registered the change in humidity, his lungs expanding more easily without the particulate load that permeated the agricultural zones. He'd forgotten what regulated environments felt like. The reception terminal directed him to a private examination suite rather than the standard assessment rooms. The door opened before he could signal his arrival, revealing a woman in Research Division whites who studied him with the same detached focus he applied to soil samples. Subject 7743K, remove your outer garments and stand on the marked platform. Dr. Venn. He recognized her name from the message header, though he'd never seen her before. She moved through the room with practiced efficiency, activating sensors and calibrating equipment without looking at him directly. He stripped to his standard issue undergarments and positioned himself where she'd indicated, his arms at his sides, his breathing still measured in 6-second intervals. The examination took 40 minutes. She worked in silence, her hands clinical and impersonal as she attached monitoring leads to his chest, his temples, his wrists. But when she checked his pulse, fingers pressed against the hollow of his throat, her touch lingered 3 seconds longer than the measurement required. He felt the warmth of her skin against his, noticed the way her breathing had shifted from the steady rhythm she'd maintained throughout the procedure. She stepped back, her expression unchanged. Your cellular regeneration rate is 37% above baseline human standards. Radiation exposure that should have caused cumulative DNA damage has instead triggered adaptive mutations in your epithelial tissue. She paused, her eyes moving from the data display to his face. You're not declining, you're evolving. Kyle said nothing. Evolution was a word from the genetics councils, the reproductive planning committees. It meant something different when applied to individuals instead of populations. We'll need longitudinal data, weekly sessions, minimum. She deactivated the sensors, her movements precise. You're being transferred to an extended observation protocol. My work assignment has been suspended pending research completion. She handed him his clothing, her fingers brushing his as he took the folded garments. The contact was brief, accidental, but her hand withdrew more slowly than necessary. Report here at 40 Nasan every 7 days. Failure to comply will result in involuntary medical custody. He dressed while she compiled her initial report, aware of her peripheral attention even when she appeared focused on her work. When he finished, she stood between him and the exit, close enough that he could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw that suggested she slept less than the recommended cycles. Your refusal of the reproductive pairing, she said, her voice lower than it had been during the examination. The tribunal records state philosophical incompatibility. What does that mean? The question violated protocol. Research division personnel weren't authorized to discuss tribunal decisions with subjects. I didn't want what they were offering, Kyle said. And now? He met her gaze, reading the subtext beneath the professional inquiry. She wasn't asking about reproductive protocols. I still don't. Something shifted in her expression, not disappointment, but recognition. She stepped aside, allowing him to pass, and he felt the absence of her proximity as a measurable change in temperature. The message from the military division arrived 16 hours later, while he was attempting to sleep in the temporary quarters the research complex had assigned him. The room was smaller than his previous dome housing, but the environmental controls worked precisely, maintaining temperature and humidity at levels his body no longer needed but still recognized as comfortable. He read the directive on his wrist display, the text identical in structure to Dr. Ven's initial summons but different in tone. Where hers had been clinical, this was commanding. Report to Military Training Facility, Sector 90620. Endurance assessment required. Attendance is not optional. Kyle closed the message and lay back on the narrow bunk, his breathing measured, his mind tracking the implications. The research division and military division didn't share resources or coordinate protocols. Someone had noticed the same anomalies Dr. Ven had documented, and now he was being pulled between institutional interests that rarely aligned. He counted his breathing intervals until sleep arrived, wondering how long he could remain a subject before becoming a solution. Chapter 2. Measurements. The military training facility operated under different principles than the research complex. Where Dr. Ven's examination suite had been sterile and controlled, Commander Sira's endurance chamber felt deliberately hostile. Temperature extremes that cycled every 15 minutes, atmospheric pressure that fluctuated randomly, oxygen concentrations that dropped without warning. The equipment didn't measure, it tested. Kyle stood in the center of the chamber, stripped to minimal clothing, while sensors tracked his physiological responses to conditions that would require full environmental suits for standard military personnel. Around him, holographic displays showed the simulated atmospheres of planets the colony councils had identified as potential expansion sites, worlds where human survival would require either extensive genetic modification or technological dependency, or adaptation. Commander Sira watched from the observation deck, her posture military straight, her attention unwavering. Unlike Dr. Ven, who maintained clinical distance, Sira's focus felt tactical. She was assessing not just his physical responses, but his decision-making under stress. The way he prioritized resource allocation in his own body when multiple systems faced simultaneous threats. The first cycle dropped the oxygen concentration to 70%, while raising the temperature to 42 degrees Celsius. Kyle slowed his breathing further, allowing his heart rate to decrease rather than accelerate. His training in environmental calibration had taught him that panic consumed more oxygen than any external threat. Through the observation window, he saw Sira lean forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. The second cycle introduced rapid pressure changes that would typically cause severe disorientation. He widened his stance, grounding himself through physical contact with the floor, and focused on a fixed point on the chamber wall. The technique was basic, used by pilots and deep space workers, but his body's response wasn't. Where others experienced nausea and equilibrium disruption, his inner ear adjusted within seconds, his brain compensating for the sensory conflict without conscious intervention. By the fourth cycle, when the chamber temperature dropped to -15 while maintaining low oxygen, Kyle noticed his body generating heat without shivering, a metabolic response that bypassed the standard thermoregulation pathways. He felt the warmth spreading from his core, watched his skin remain flush despite the cold, and understood why the military division wanted him. The assessment lasted 3 hours. When the chamber finally returned to standard conditions, Commander Sira entered personally rather than sending subordinates. She carried water in a regulation canister, crouching beside him as he sat against the curved wall, his breathing still controlled despite the depletion. "Drink," she said, not a request. He took the canister and she watched him swallow with the same tactical focus she'd maintained throughout the assessment. Her hand moved to his chest, ostensibly checking his heart rate, though the sensors had provided that data continuously. Her palm pressed flat against his sternum, and he felt the heat from his skin transfer to hers through the thin material of her uniform sleeve. She held the contact longer than any measurement required, her eyes on his face rather than the data displays. When she finally withdrew her hand, her fingers trailed briefly across his ribs before breaking contact entirely. "Baseline human response to these conditions is unconsciousness within 40 minutes, she said. "Permanent neurological damage within 90. You lasted 3 hours with no decline in cognitive function." She stood, her expression carefully neutral. "The Council needs to know if this is replicable." Kyle set the empty canister aside. "You mean they want to know if it can be weaponized? They want to know if humanity's future depends on genetic modification or individual adaptation." She offered him her hand, pulling him upright when he accepted. The grip was firm, professional, but her thumb pressed briefly against his pulse point before she released him. "Those are different questions with different implications." Over the next week, he split his time between Dr. Ven's clinical observations and Commander Sira's endurance trials. The two women worked for different divisions with different objectives, but their methods developed unexpected similarities. Both found reasons to maintain physical proximity beyond what their instruments required. Both watched him with attention that shifted from professional assessment to something neither verbalized. Dr. Ven's examinations became longer, more detailed. She mapped the scarring across his back from solar radiation burns, her fingers tracing the patterns where damaged tissue had healed into configurations that resembled intentional markings rather than random injury. She asked permission before touching him, but her hands lingered after the measurements concluded, testing the texture of his skin, the flexibility of the scar tissue, the warmth his body generated in response to her proximity. "Your nervous system is rewiring itself," she explained during one session, her fingertips pressed against the base of his skull, creating new pain thresholds, new sensory interpretations. Her voice had dropped slightly, intimate in the quiet examination room. "Does this hurt?" "No." "Does it feel like anything?" He considered the question honestly. "Yes." She didn't ask him to elaborate, but her fingers remained where they were, the contact extending beyond clinical necessity into something that felt like curiosity of a different kind. Commander Sira's trials intensified, pushing him through simulations that would incapacitate trained soldiers. But between the trials, she found reasons to work beside him directly, calibrating equipment, reviewing data, conducting field assessments that required them to operate in confined spaces where their shoulders touched, where he could smell the faint scent of regulation soap on her skin, where her breathing synchronized with his during physical exertion. After a particularly brutal thermal cycle, she handed him water and sat beside him in the narrow recovery cell, their bodies close enough that he felt the heat radiating from her through her uniform. She turned her head, studying his profile, and he saw the fracture in her composure, the moment when tactical assessment gave way to something less controlled. "The Council will use your data to make decisions about humanity's future," she said quietly. "But you're not data. You're—" She stopped, reconsidering. "You survived because you refused to comply with their system. Now they want to turn that survival into a new system." Kyle met her gaze, seeing his own understanding reflected there. "And you want to know if I'll comply this time? I want to know if you have a choice." The question stayed with him after the session ended, following him back to his temporary quarters where the environmental controls hummed efficiently and the walls were thin enough that he could hear Dr. Venn moving in the adjacent research suite. The subtle sounds of another person existing an arm's length away through artificial barriers. Chapter 3. Protocols. The third woman entered his life without introduction, appearing during his exercise rotation in the military facilities training sector. Lyra carried data tablets and wore administrative division colors, but she moved through the space with the same focused attention that characterized both Dr. Venn and Commander Sira. She stood at the observation rail, watching him work through strength trials that would normally require three-person teams, her expression thoughtful in ways that had nothing to do with data collection. When he finished the rotation, she was waiting with a towel and a formal notification. "The Expansion Coalition requests your participation in their preliminary assessment protocols," she said, handing him both items. "You're being considered for their Territorial Pioneer program." Kyle dried his face, reading the notification without reaction. The Expansion Coalition represented one of three major political factions competing for influence over the Council's resource allocation decisions. If they were recruiting him, it meant his survival data had reached beyond the research and military divisions into the political architecture. "What does the assessment involve?" "Physical verification, compatibility evaluations, resource projection modeling." Lyra's gaze tracked the movement of his hands as he lowered the towel. "Full body mapping to determine if your adaptive traits are transferable." "Transferable to what?" "To populations that would be seeded on worlds where standard human physiology fails." She paused, her voice dropping slightly. "You'd be the baseline for a new expansion model. One that doesn't rely on genetic modification or technological dependency." The implication was clear. They wanted him not just as data, but as genetic material, reproductive protocols designed to propagate his adaptability across new population centers. The same offer the tribunal had made 3 years ago, repackaged with political authority. "And if I decline?" "The coalition has council authorization to conduct the assessment regardless of individual consent." She said it evenly, without apology. "But cooperation would improve your position in the final recommendations." Kyle understood the translation. Comply voluntarily and retain some degree of agency. Resist and lose even that. Lyra began appearing during his scheduled sessions with both Dr. Venn and Commander Sira, ostensibly to coordinate between divisions but practically to conduct her own observations. She scheduled private briefings in smaller conference rooms than protocol required, spaces where she had to stand close enough that her sleeve brushed his arm when she gestured toward holographic projections, where the recycled air carried the warmth of her proximity. During one briefing, explaining the coalition's resource allocation proposals, she reached across the table and caught his wrist mid-gesture, her thumb pressed against his pulse point, holding him still while she finished describing the relocation parameters. She didn't apologize when she finally released him, and he didn't pull away during the contact, both of them acknowledging the gesture's weight without naming it. The coalition's assessment protocols were more invasive than either the research or military evaluations. They required full-body scans that mapped not just his physiology, but his genetic markers, his metabolic pathways, his neurological patterns. The technicians worked with clinical efficiency, but Lyra supervised personally, her presence constant throughout the procedures. When the scans required him to remain motionless for extended periods, she stood close enough that he could see the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her focus moved from the data displays to his face, tracking the rhythm of his breathing, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained steady despite the physical discomfort of prolonged immobility. "Your genetic profile shows markers that were systematically selected against during the population optimization programs," she said during one session, studying the holographic projection of his DNA sequences. "Traits the Council's classified as inefficient for controlled environments. Traits that make me functional in uncontrolled ones," Kyle said. Exactly. She moved around the projection, her eyes on the data rather than him. The Coalition believes humanity made a strategic error 11 generations ago. We optimized for stability instead of adaptability. Now we're facing expansion opportunities we can't exploit because our population can't survive outside artificial conditions. So they want to reverse engineer me. They want to understand if your survival is replicable through natural reproduction or if it requires conditions that can't be controlled. Lyra stopped in front of him, the projection flickering between them. Either answer reshapes the colony's entire approach to expansion. The question beneath her words was the same one Dr. Venn and Commander Sierra had asked in their own ways. Would he participate in becoming the solution to humanity's self-imposed limitations, even if it meant losing whatever remained of his individual autonomy? Dr. Venn requested permission to conduct long-term proximity studies, arguing that continuous observation across full sleep cycles would reveal adaptive mechanisms that couldn't be captured during scheduled assessments. The Council approved a cohabitation research protocol that placed them in adjacent quarters with shared environmental controls. The arrangement created an enforced intimacy that transformed their interactions. Mornings when they crossed paths in the narrow corridor between their sleeping spaces, evenings when she worked in the shared common area while he existed as both colleague and subject in the same confined environment, nights when the thin barrier between their quarters transmitted the sounds of breathing, movement, the subtle acoustics of another person an arm's length away through artificial walls. Dr. Venn maintained professional boundaries during official observation periods, but in the unscheduled moments, early mornings before monitoring equipment activated, late evenings after data compilation, proximity shifted into something neither of them named explicitly. She began sitting closer during their informal discussions, near enough that their knees almost touched, that he could see the precise moment her focus shifted from data analysis to tracking the rhythm of his breathing. Once, reaching past him to adjust an environmental control panel, she paused with her arm extended across his chest, her face close enough that he felt the warmth of her exhalation against his collarbone. Neither of them moved for 3 full seconds before she completed the adjustment and stepped away, her hand trailing briefly across his shoulder. The contact accumulated, small touches that carried weight beyond their physical dimensions, moments of proximity that extended longer than function required. She checked his temperature by pressing her palm against his forehead, her fingers sliding into his hair. She monitored his cardiovascular response by placing her hand over his heart, feeling the rhythm through his chest wall. She tested his sensory acuity by tracing patterns on his forearm, watching his pupils dilate in response to the contact. Each touch was clinically justifiable. None of them were only clinical. Commander Sierra violated protocol by requisitioning him for field training exercises that had no tactical justification, creating reasons to keep him under military jurisdiction when Council arbitration threatened to transfer him to civilian research facilities permanently. During a survival simulation in the restricted biodome sectors, she ordered all other personnel out and worked beside him in dismantling emergency shelters, their bodies moving in synchronized rhythm through physical labor that left them both overheated and exhausted. When they finally stopped, sitting against the curved wall of the dome with shoulders touching from lack of space, she turned her head and looked at him with an expression that held no pretense of professional assessment, just raw acknowledgement of wanting something she had no authorization to claim. Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing without discussion. They sat that way for several minutes, breathing in sync, neither of them speaking until the session timer indicated their allotted period had expired. Cale returned to his quarters that night, aware that he was navigating 3 separate relationships that had evolved beyond their institutional frameworks, each woman approaching him from a different angle, but converging on the same fundamental question. Could he be both person and solution, or would choosing one require abandoning the other? Chapter 4. Convergence. The Council scheduled a final tribunal to determine jurisdictional authority over his case. The notification arrived simultaneously to all 3 divisions, triggering immediate escalation. Dr. Venn's research protocols intensified, Commander Sierra's training simulations doubled in frequency, and Lyra's coalition briefings became daily occurrences, each faction racing to compile evidence that would support their claim to his future. Cale felt himself being pulled in three directions, his time divided into segments controlled by institutional priorities rather than personal choice. But the women themselves had begun to fracture from their official roles, their interactions with him developing layers that had nothing to do with research data, military assessments, or political leverage. Doctor. Venn stopped scheduling their proximity observations as formal sessions, instead allowing them to evolve into shared routines, meals eaten in the common area between their quarters, evenings when she worked on data compilation while he read reports from his former environmental calibration work, mornings when they prepared for their respective obligations in the same space without needing to coordinate verbally. The intimacy of routine built connections that formal examinations couldn't capture. He learned that she preferred her coffee at exactly 73 degrees Celsius, that she had a habit of pulling her hair back when frustrated with inconclusive data, that she sometimes stood at the window overlooking the central hub and watched the colony's environmental system cycle with an expression that suggested she was questioning the entire framework of controlled human existence. One evening, she abandoned her data compilation entirely and sat beside him on the narrow couch close enough that their thighs touched. She didn't explain the deviation from her usual routine, and he didn't ask. They sat in silence, the only sound the hum of the environmental controls and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. Her hand moved to his, their fingers interlacing with the same natural ease that had characterized his contact with Commander Sira. The touch felt different from her clinical examinations. No measurement, no data collection, just the warmth of skin against skin and the acknowledgement that whatever existed between them had grown beyond professional boundaries. "The tribunal will force you to choose," she said quietly. "Research subject, military asset, or political prototype." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "None of those options include being a person." "Maybe I'm not," Kyle said. "Maybe I'm what they're making me." "No." Her grip on his hand tightened. "You're who you've always been, they just can't categorize it." Commander Sira's approach was more direct. She requested a private meeting outside official channels, arriving at his quarters after the shift rotations had emptied the corridors. She stood in the doorway for several seconds before entering, her uniform regulation perfect, but her composure showing the same fractures he'd noticed during their field exercises. "The military division is prepared to offer full operational autonomy in exchange for your cooperation with the expansion training program," she said, delivering the statement like a mission brief. Then she stopped, her shoulders dropping slightly. "That's the official proposal. What I came to say is different." Kyle waited, recognizing the shift in her tone. "I've spent my entire career maintaining protocols designed to optimize efficiency," Sira continued. "Following orders, enforcing compliance, believing the system worked because it produced predictable results." She moved further into the room, her eyes meeting his. "Then you survived 3 years in conditions that should have broken you, and every protocol I followed to understand why kept proving inadequate." She closed the distance between them, standing close enough that he could see the tension in her jaw, the way her breathing had shifted from controlled to something less regulated. "I don't want you as a military asset," she said quietly. "I want—" She stopped, reconsidering. Her hand rose, hesitated, then touched his face, her palm against his jaw, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. "I want to stop measuring you and just be here." The contact was different from her tactical assessments, different from the functional touches that had accumulated during their training sessions. This was deliberate, personal, carrying no justification beyond the want itself. Kyle covered her hand with his, acknowledging the gesture's weight. They stood that way for a long moment before she withdrew, her composure reassembling, but not quite achieving its former rigidity. Lyra's approach was the most complex, layered with political implications that made genuine connection difficult to separate from strategic positioning. But during one late evening briefing, after she'd finished explaining the coalition's final proposal, she set aside her data tablets and looked at him with an expression that held none of her usual administrative efficiency. "They've calculated your reproductive potential across 6 different expansion scenarios," she said. "Projected genetic propagation rates, population sustainability models, resource allocation frameworks." She paused. "None of it accounts for whether you'd want any of those futures. Would it matter if I didn't?" To the coalition? No. She moved around the small table that separated them, sitting on its edge so she was closer to his eye level. To me? Yes. Her hand moved to his, not grasping but resting alongside, their fingers parallel, but not quite touching. I'm supposed to convince you that cooperation serves the greater good, that your individual preferences are secondary to humanity's survival needs. She shifted, her fingers sliding between his. But I keep thinking about what it costs to be the solution everyone needs. Whether you can survive that differently than you survived the outer domes. The question resonated with the same concerns Dr. Venn and Commander Sira had raised, each woman approaching from different institutional frameworks, but arriving at the same fundamental recognition that making him valuable had made him vulnerable in ways no physical hardship could replicate. The night before the tribunal, all three women appeared at his quarters at different times, each carrying the weight of unspoken proposals that had nothing to do with faction politics. Dr. Venn arrived first, data tablets in hand that she never referenced. She stood just inside the doorway, her professional composure visibly strained. I've documented everything they asked for, she said. Cellular regeneration rates, adaptive mutation patterns, neurological plasticity indices. Enough evidence to support keeping you under continuous research observation. She set the tablets aside. But every data point I've collected just proves you're more than what they're trying to measure. She crossed to where he sat, her movements uncertain in a way he'd never seen during their examinations. When she reached him, she knelt so they were at eye level, her hands resting on his knees. Tell me you know you're not just research data, she said quietly. Kyle covered her hands with his. I know. She leaned forward, her forehead touching his, and they remained that way, no measurement, no protocol, just the simple physics of two people choosing proximity over distance. Lyra came next, carrying contract modifications that remained unsigned on the narrow table. She paced the small space, her usual administrative precision replaced by visible agitation. The Coalition's final offer includes reproductive autonomy within their expansion framework, she said. You'd have input on genetic compatibility selections, resource allocation priorities, territorial assignments. She stopped pacing, turning to face him. They're offering you the closest thing to choice that exists within their system. But it's still their system. Yes. She sat beside him, closer than professional distance allowed. I've been trying to find a way to make their solution align with what you might actually want. But I don't know what that is because I've been treating you as a strategic asset, instead of asking. Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the same natural ease that had developed during their briefings. What do you want, Kyle? The question was simple but carried impossible weight. He didn't have an answer that would satisfy the Coalition's frameworks, or Lyra's need to reconcile her role with her growing recognition that he was more than the strategic resource she'd been sent to secure. I don't know, he said honestly. She nodded, accepting the uncertainty. Her head came to rest on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, her breathing gradually synchronizing with his. Commander Sira arrived last, after the shift rotations had reduced corridor traffic to near silence. She entered without announcement, her uniform regulation perfect, but her expression carrying none of the tactical control she maintained during official interactions. I violated 17 different protocols to keep you under military jurisdiction, she said, remaining near the doorway. Falsified training requirements, manufactured tactical justifications, compromised operational efficiency metrics. She paused. Every violation was worth it if it meant you weren't transferred to permanent research custody or political administration. Kyle stood, crossing to where she waited. Why? Because both of those outcomes would have turned you into infrastructure, Sira said. Research specimen or political prototype. Something to be maintained and exploited rather than... She stopped, her jaw tightening. Rather than someone who should have the right to refuse being useful. Her hand rose to his chest, palm flat against his sternum, but this time there was no pretense of measuring his heart rate. Just contact, acknowledgement, the admission that her tactical assessments had long since evolved into something her military training hadn't prepared her to navigate. Kyle covered her hand with his, feeling the tension in her fingers, the way her breathing had shifted from controlled to something more vulnerable. When she stepped closer, eliminating the careful distance she'd maintained throughout their interactions, he didn't retreat. Her other hand moved to his face, her thumb brushing along his jaw, and for several seconds they stood in that intimate proximity without speaking. "The tribunal convenes at dawn," she said quietly. "Whatever they decide will determine your future for the next decade at minimum, probably longer." Her eyes searched his face. "And I'm supposed to advocate for the military's claim because that's my function. But I can't stop thinking that all of us, research, military, coalition, we're all just different methods of making you not yours." She kissed him then, a brief contact that carried the weight of everything she couldn't say within her official capacity. When she pulled back, her composure had fractured completely, leaving only the raw acknowledgement of wanting something she had no authorization to claim. After she left, Kyle stood alone in his quarters, the sounds of 3 women moving through adjacent spaces, audible through the thin walls. Dr. Venn in her research suite, Lyra in a temporary administrative office, Commander Sira in the corridor outside. Each of them waiting for dawn, for the tribunal that would determine which institutional framework would claim authority over his future. He measured his breathing in 6-second intervals, the rhythm steady despite the awareness that no adaptation could prepare him for being simultaneously wanted as a person and needed as a solution. The legend they were creating from his survival had already grown beyond any truth he could embody, and tomorrow the Council would decide which version of that legend served humanity's needs. Whether any version served his remained an unanswered question. Chapter 5. Partition. The tribunal chamber occupied neutral territory, a council meeting space designed for institutional arbitration rather than individual consideration. Kyle sat in the designated subject position, a raised platform that allowed the council members to observe him from 3 sides, while representatives from research, military, and coalition factions presented their cases. Dr. Venn spoke first, her presentation clinically precise. She displayed his cellular regeneration data, his adaptive mutation patterns, his neurological plasticity indices, 3 years of observations compiled into evidence that he represented a critical research opportunity. Her voice remained professionally neutral throughout, but when she referenced the proximity studies, her eyes found his briefly before returning to the council. Subject 7743K demonstrates adaptive mechanisms that contradict our fundamental assumptions about human genetic optimization, she concluded. Continued research custody is essential to determine whether these traits can be understood and potentially replicated through controlled means. Commander Sierra's presentation emphasized operational utility. She showed his endurance trial results, his performance in extreme environmental simulations, his capacity to function in conditions that incapacitated trained military personnel. Her tactical assessment framed him as proof that human adaptability could be weaponized for territorial expansion without genetic modification. The military division requests custody for advanced training protocols, she stated. Subject 7743K's survival capabilities make him ideal for pioneer operations in hostile environments where standard personnel fail. His data could reshape our entire approach to expansion readiness. Lyra presented the coalition's position last, her argument layered with political and reproductive implications. She outlined expansion scenarios that depended on naturally adaptive populations rather than genetically modified ones, resource allocation models that prioritized individual survival traits over collective engineering, territorial claims that required humans capable of thriving without technological dependency. The Expansion Coalition proposes integrating Subject 7743K into our Territorial Pioneer Program as genetic foundation for new population centers, she said. His reproductive participation would seed naturally adaptive traits across expansion sites, creating sustainable human presence without infrastructure requirements. Each presentation treated him as solution to different institutional problems. None acknowledged him as the origin of those solutions. The council deliberated for 4 hours, while Kyle remained on the observation platform, listening to bureaucrats debate his future using terminology that reduced 3 years of survival to data points and strategic assets. They discussed his cellular regeneration as if it existed separately from the body that produced it, his adaptive responses as if they could be extracted and replicated without context, his genetic material as if reproduction was primarily a resource allocation problem. Dr. Venn sat in the research division section, her posture rigid, her eyes on the council members rather than him. Commander Sira occupied the military observer position, her expression tactically neutral, despite the tension visible in her shoulders. Lyra stood with the coalition representatives, her administrative composure intact, but her hands clasped tightly enough that her knuckles showed white. The council reached decision by majority vote. Split custody across all 3 divisions, with Kale's time partitioned into scheduled segments serving each faction's institutional objectives. Research would conduct ongoing proximity studies 3 days per week. Military would maintain training protocols for 2 days. Coalition would supervise reproductive assessment and genetic mapping on remaining time. No provision for autonomous decision-making. No acknowledgement that the person being partitioned might have preferences about how his existence was allocated. The tribunal adjourned with clinical efficiency, council members departing to address other resource management concerns, while division representatives received their custody schedules. Kyle remained on the platform until the chamber emptied, his breathing measured, his hands steady despite the awareness that he'd been transformed from individual into shared infrastructure. Dr. Venn waited outside the chamber, her professional composure visibly strained. When he emerged, she didn't speak immediately, just stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched, her eyes on the corridor floor rather than his face. "I advocated for research custody because it was the only framework I had," she said quietly. "But listening to them reduce 3 years of your survival to cellular data points," she stopped, her jaw tightening. "I keep thinking about what you said the night before the tribunal, that maybe you're what they're making you. And I realize I've been participating in that construction." Kyle turned to face her fully. "You've also been the only person who asked if I knew I was more than research data. Asking isn't enough." She met his gaze, her eyes carrying a weight that had nothing to do with scientific observation. "I requested transfer to a different research project, effective immediately." The statement landed with unexpected force. "Why?" "Because I can't keep measuring you while pretending the measurements don't serve a system designed to exploit your survival." Her hand moved to his arm, contact that felt different from her clinical examinations, urgent, almost desperate. "And because the proximity studies stopped being about research months ago, and I can't continue them while knowing the data will be used to justify your partition." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "The council gave me 3 days per week of your time. I'm formally declining the allocation." Before he could respond, she left, her departure swift enough that he understood it was the only way she could maintain the decision without reconsidering. Commander Sira's approach was characteristically direct. She appeared at his newly assigned quarters, neutral residential space rather than the research suite he'd shared with Dr. Venn, and entered without waiting for acknowledgement. "The military division is prepared to utilize our 2-day allocation for advanced endurance protocols," she said, delivering the statement with her usual tactical precision. Then she stopped, her shoulders dropping. "That's the official brief. What I actually came to say is that I'm resigning my commission." The words hung in the small space between them, their implications complex enough that Kyle needed several seconds to process them fully. "You're leaving the military division?" "I'm leaving the system that turned your survival into strategic asset." Sira's expression carried no regret, just clear-eyed certainty. "I've spent 17 years following protocols designed to optimize human utility. Watching the tribunal reduce you to custody schedules and reproductive potential made me realize I've been complicit in constructing the exact framework I thought I was serving." She moved closer, her hands remaining at her sides, but her posture shifting from military rigidity to something less defended. "I told you I wanted to stop measuring you and just be here. But here is a system designed to make that impossible, unless I extract myself from it entirely." Kale felt the weight of her decision, the cost she was accepting to refuse participation in his partition. "What will you do?" "Request transfer to Outer Dome maintenance. It's the only work assignment that doesn't require institutional loyalty oaths or reproductive council oversight." She paused, something almost like humor crossing her face. "It's where they sent you 3 years ago as punishment. Apparently it's also the closest thing to autonomous existence that's available in the colonies." Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the same natural ease that had developed during their training sessions. The military wants me to train you to survive impossible conditions, but you already know how to do that. What you need is someone who understands that survival isn't the same as living." She kissed him then, longer than the brief contact from the night before the tribunal, her free hand moving to his face with a tenderness that contradicted everything he'd learned about her tactical precision. When she pulled back, her eyes held his. "I'm not declining my allocation because I don't want proximity," she said quietly. "I'm declining it because I refuse to participate in proximity that serves institutional objectives rather than genuine choice." She left before he could formulate response, her departure carrying the same swift certainty as Dr. Ven's. Lyra arrived last, long after the shift rotations had emptied the corridors. She entered carrying data tablets that she set aside immediately, her administrative composure absent entirely. "The Coalition is prepared to move forward with reproductive assessment protocols on their allocated schedule," she said, the words sounding rehearsed. Then she stopped, pressing her palms against her eyes. "I've been practicing that statement for 2 hours, trying to convince myself I could deliver it without acknowledging what it actually means." She lowered her hands, looking at him directly. "They want me to coordinate your genetic mapping, supervise compatibility testing, facilitate reproductive contracts with approved population candidates, transform you into biological infrastructure for their expansion model." Kyle heard the strain in her voice, saw the way her hands had begun to shake slightly. "I came here believing the Coalition's approach was more ethical than genetic modification or technological dependency," Lyra continued. "That prioritizing natural adaptation honored human autonomy better than engineering or control systems. But natural doesn't mean voluntary, and adaptation doesn't mean choice." She crossed to where he sat, her movements uncertain. When she reached him, she knelt like Dr. Venn had the night before the tribunal, her hands resting on his knees. "I can't coordinate your reproductive partition," she said quietly. "I can't sit across from you discussing genetic compatibility while knowing you're being offered the illusion of choice within a framework designed to eliminate actual autonomy." Her hands tightened on his knees. "And I can't keep pretending my interest in you is primarily political when it stopped being that months ago." Kyle covered her hands with his, feeling the tension in her fingers, the way her breathing had shifted to something less controlled. "I'm formally requesting transfer out of the Coalition's administrative division," she said. "I'll probably end up in resource allocation or environmental management, somewhere that doesn't require me to participate in transforming people into strategic assets." She rose and he stood with her, their hands still connected. When she leaned into him, her forehead against his chest, he felt the full weight of what she was sacrificing: political position, institutional influence, the carefully constructed career she'd built within the Coalition's framework. "The tribunal gave me authority over your time," she whispered against his chest. "I'm using that authority to decline it entirely." She pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes carrying the same complex mixture of want and refusal that characterized Dr. Venn and Commander Sierra's departures. "I want proximity that isn't scheduled," she said, "contact that isn't protocol, time with you that serves nothing except the fact that I want it, and you're willing to give it." She kissed him with the same deliberate tenderness Sierra had shown, her hands moving to his face, her body close enough that he could feel her heartbeat against his chest. When she stepped back, releasing him slowly, her composure had fractured completely. "They tried to partition you across 3 institutional frameworks," she said. "We're refusing to participate in the partition." After she left, Kyle stood alone in his neutral quarters, processing the implications of 3 women who had chosen individual refusal over institutional compliance, who had declined the authority they'd been granted because accepting it required treating him as infrastructure rather than person. The Council had attempted to resolve competing claims through partition. Instead, they'd created a different kind of void, one where the institutional frameworks designed to manage his future had been voluntarily abandoned by the very people assigned to enforce them. He measured his breathing in 6-second intervals, recognizing that he'd survived the tribunal only to face a more complex challenge, determining what existence looked like when the systems designed to control it had withdrawn their authority, leaving autonomy as possibility rather than permission. Chapter 6, Hollow. The partition schedule remained in effect despite the personnel transfers. Research Division assigned a new lead scientist to coordinate Kale's proximity studies, a competent professional who measured his responses with clinical precision, but without the layered complexity that had characterized Dr. Ven's examinations. Military Division rotated through 3 different training supervisors in 2 weeks, each one competent, but treating him as performance data rather than tactical partner. Coalition Administration sent rotating representatives who conducted genetic mapping with bureaucratic efficiency, processing his biological material as reproductive infrastructure without acknowledging the person producing it. The work was technically identical to what he'd experienced before the tribunal, but the absence of the 3 women who had refused to participate transformed it into something hollow. Measurements without meaning, protocols without purpose beyond institutional documentation. Kyle endured the partition because he'd learned endurance in the outer domes, where survival required accepting conditions that couldn't be changed. But accepting didn't mean adapting, and he felt himself withdrawing into the same emotional minimization he'd practiced during his first year of manual labor, reducing existence to sequential tasks, measuring time in shift rotations, maintaining breathing rhythms that regulated nothing except the physical mechanics of oxygen exchange. Dr. Venn had transferred to theoretical genetics research in a sector isolated from human subject studies. Commander Sierra had been reassigned to outer dome maintenance in agricultural Sector 7, working the same radiation-exposed shifts Kyle had endured before his biological anomalies triggered institutional attention. Lyra had requested transfer to environmental resource management, a bureaucratic position that involved data compilation rather than human interaction. He knew their locations because the colony's personnel directory was publicly accessible, designed to maintain transparency in resource allocation. He didn't contact them because their departures had been deliberate refusals of the partition framework, and reaching out would undermine the autonomy they'd sacrificed institutional position to claim. But the colony operated on controlled schedules that created predictable overlap between residential sectors and work assignments. He began encountering them in neutral spaces, transit corridors, resource distribution centers, the observation platforms overlooking the central hub where off-shift personnel sometimes gathered to watch the environmental systems cycle. The first encounter happened 3 weeks after the tribunal. Kyle was returning from a military endurance trial when he saw Dr. Venn standing at one of the observation platforms, her posture suggesting she'd been there long enough for her breath to fog the transparent paneling. He stopped several meters away, uncertain whether approaching would violate the boundaries she'd established by transferring divisions. She turned before he could decide, her eyes finding his with the same precision she'd once applied to monitoring his physiological responses. They stood in that weighted silence for several seconds before she closed the distance between them. "How are the new research protocols?" she asked, her voice carrying none of her former clinical detachment. "Competent." "That's not what I asked." Kyle met her gaze, reading the subtext beneath the question. "Hollow." She nodded, accepting the assessment. Her hand moved to his arm, contact that felt different from her examinations, uncertain, almost tentative. "I keep reviewing the data from our proximity studies, looking for patterns I missed. But the measurements only show adaptation mechanics, not what the adaptation cost you." The cost was surviving. No. Her grip on his arm tightened slightly. Surviving was what you did before institutional attention. What you've been doing since is something different. Enduring systematic observation, tolerating invasive assessment, accepting partition across frameworks designed to extract your utility. She paused. That's not the same as survival. That's compliance. The distinction resonated with something he'd been unable to articulate, the difference between adapting to hostile atmospheric conditions and accepting institutional reduction to biological infrastructure. "I transferred divisions because I couldn't keep participating in your compliance," Dr. Venn continued. "But I don't know if refusing my partition allocation actually changed anything except removing me from direct involvement." Kale covered her hand with his, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin material of his standard-issue sleeve. "It changed you being part of the system that created the partition. Maybe." She shifted closer, her other hand moving to his chest, palm flat against his sternum, in a gesture he recognized from their proximity studies. But this time, There was no pretense of measurement, just the acknowledgement of contact chosen rather than scheduled. I miss the mornings when we shared space without protocols, the evenings when we existed in the same room without objectives. I miss that too. They stood that way for several minutes, her hand over his heart, his fingers interlaced with hers, both of them aware that the observation platform was public space, where extended contact violated several different social protocols. Neither of them moved to separate. When she finally stepped back, her professional composure hadn't reassembled completely. The theoretical genetics sector has minimal oversight requirements. If you wanted to visit outside scheduled allocations, there wouldn't be compliance documentation. The invitation carried implications about autonomous choice versus institutional permission, about proximity selected rather than assigned. Kyle nodded, understanding that she was offering what she'd refused to give under the partition framework, contact that served nothing except mutual want. He encountered Commander Sierra in Agricultural Sector 7 2 days later. She was conducting equipment maintenance in one of the outer domes, her civilian work assignment requiring the same physical labor he'd performed for 3 years before his adaptive responses triggered institutional attention. When she noticed him observing from the dome's entrance, she set aside the calibration tools and crossed to where he stood. Her greeting was characteristically direct. "You're not scheduled for agricultural sector today." "I'm not scheduled anywhere for 4 hours. Transit time between military training and coalition assessment." She nodded, accepting the explanation. Her eyes tracked his face with the same tactical focus she'd maintained during their endurance trials, but the assessment held different weight now. Concern rather than data collection. "How are you managing the partition?" "I'm enduring it." "That's not managing. That's surviving." Sierra's jaw tightened slightly. "You spent 3 years proving you could survive conditions designed to break compliance. Now they've found a different way to break it. Not through physical hardship, but through systematic extraction of everything that makes survival worth the effort." Kyle heard echoes of Dr. Venn's distinction between survival and compliance, both women recognizing patterns in his responses that he hadn't articulated even to himself. "I resigned my commission because I refused to participate in that extraction," Sierra continued. "But I keep thinking about whether my refusal actually protected you, or just removed the only person in the military division who saw you as more than tactical asset. You refused to use the authority you were granted. That matters. Does it?" She moved closer, her hand finding his arm with the same unconscious precision she'd demonstrated during their training sessions. "You're still being partitioned, still enduring systematic assessment, still accepting treatment that reduces you to infrastructure." Her grip tightened. "All I did was decline my allocated portion of that treatment." Kyle covered her hand with his, feeling the tension in her fingers. The way her breathing had shifted from controlled to something less regulated. "You proved that the partition could be refused. That institutional authority isn't absolute." Sierra's expression shifted, something almost like hope crossing her face. "Is that what you're planning? Refusing the partition entirely?" The question carried weight he wasn't prepared to address. Implications about autonomy versus compliance, individual choice versus systematic control. He'd spent 3 years surviving by accepting conditions that couldn't be changed. Refusal was a different kind of adaptation, one he hadn't yet learned. "I don't know," he said honestly. She nodded, accepting the uncertainty. Her hand moved from his arm to his face, palm against his jaw in a gesture that recalled their moment in the biodome after the survival simulation. "The outer dome maintenance schedule has minimal supervision. If you wanted to work a shift here, instead of attending coalition reproductive assessment, there wouldn't be enforcement protocols for several hours." The offer was similar to Dr. Venn's, proximity chosen rather than assigned, time allocated according to mutual preference rather than institutional schedule. Kyle leaned into her touch, acknowledging the invitation without verbally committing to it. When she kissed him, her free hand finding his chest, he felt the difference between contact mandated by partition schedules and contact chosen despite those schedules, the weight of autonomy in a system designed to eliminate it. Lyra found him in the resource distribution center during an unscheduled interval between partition obligations. She was reviewing environmental data on a public terminal when he entered, her administrative composure intact until she noticed his presence. Then her professional efficiency fractured, revealing the same vulnerable uncertainty he'd seen the night she declined her coalition allocation. She approached without greeting, her eyes searching his face with intensity that had nothing to do with political assessment. "The coalition sends weekly requests for my reinstatement to administrative division," she said without preamble. "They're experiencing coordination inefficiencies with your reproductive assessment protocols. Apparently the rotating representatives lack my institutional knowledge of your case. Are you considering accepting?" "No." The response was immediate, certain, but I keep questioning whether my transfer actually changed anything except removing me from direct involvement in your partition. She paused, her voice dropping. "You're still being processed as reproductive infrastructure, still enduring genetic mapping and compatibility testing. My refusal to coordinate didn't prevent the assessment, it just made the assessment less efficient." Kyle heard the echo of concerns Dr. Venn and Commander Sierra had both expressed, the question of whether individual refusal mattered when the institutional framework continued operating regardless. "You proved the framework could be challenged," he said. "That authority could be declined even when granted." Lyra's expression shifted, her eyes holding his with renewed focus. "Is that what you're planning? Challenging the partition framework?" The question was identical to Sierra's, carrying the same implications about autonomy versus compliance. He still didn't have an answer that would satisfy either the institutional systems or the women who had refused to participate in those systems. "I'm learning what refusal looks like," he said carefully. She moved closer, her hand finding his with the same natural ease that had developed during their coalition briefings. "The Environmental Resource Management Division has flexible scheduling. If you wanted to meet outside partition allocations, there wouldn't be oversight documentation for several hours." The pattern was clear now. All three women offering the same fundamental choice: proximity selected rather than assigned, contact chosen rather than scheduled, time allocated according to mutual preference rather than institutional mandate. Kyle interlaced his fingers with hers, acknowledging the invitation. When she leaned into him, her forehead against his chest like she'd done the night before the tribunal, he felt the accumulated weight of three women who had sacrificed institutional position to refuse participation in his systematic reduction to utility. "They partitioned you across 3 frameworks," Lyra said quietly against his chest. "We declined our allocations, but the partition continues without us, and you're still enduring it." She pulled back enough to look at him. "What would it take for you to refuse it entirely?" The question crystallized what all three women had been asking in their different ways. When would his endurance transform into refusal, his survival into actual autonomy, his compliance into deliberate choice? He didn't have an answer yet, but standing in the resource distribution center with Lyra's hand in his, her eyes holding the same complex mixture of want and concern that characterized Dr. Venn and Commander Sierra's approaches, he felt the first stirring of something beyond endurance, the possibility that adaptation might include learning to refuse conditions that couldn't be survived without losing the self that made survival meaningful. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'm beginning to understand the question." She kissed him then, her hands moving to his face with deliberate tenderness, and he recognized in the contact the same principle all three women were demonstrating, that some forms of proximity were worth the institutional cost of claiming them, that autonomy sometimes required sacrificing the frameworks designed to grant permission, that refusal could be its own kind of survival. When she stepped back, releasing him slowly, her administrative composure had been replaced entirely by something more vulnerable and certain at once. "We'll be waiting," she said quietly, "when you're ready to refuse." Chapter 7. Erosion. Kyle began missing scheduled partition obligations. The first absence was accidental, a miscalculation of transit time between military training and coalition assessment that left him 12 minutes late for genetic mapping. The second was experimental, a deliberate decision to remain in his quarters when research proximity studies were scheduled, testing whether the institutional frameworks would enforce compliance or simply document non-compliance. They documented. Within 3 weeks, his partition schedule showed 17 documented absences, each one logged as efficiency deviation requiring corrective protocols. But the corrective protocols never materialized. Research Division filed formal complaints about incomplete data collection. Military training supervisors noted decreased performance metrics due to irregular attendance. Coalition administration compiled reports about reproductive assessment delays, but no one enforced the schedule. The realization arrived slowly. The partition framework had no mechanism for compelling compliance beyond the assumption that subjects would comply. The system operated on voluntary participation, justified through resource allocation, position security, and the implicit threat of demotion to less favorable work assignments. But Kyle had already survived the worst assignment the colonies offered, 3 years in outer dome maintenance that should have broken his health and compliance both. He had nothing left to lose through non-compliance. He began spending his unscheduled time in the sectors where Dr. Then Commander Sierra and Lyra had been reassigned. The visits were irregular, unpredictable, governed by no protocol except mutual availability and proximity, chosen rather than mandated. Sometimes he found Dr. Venn in the theoretical genetics sector, reviewing data that had nothing to do with human subjects. Sometimes he encountered Commander Sierra in agricultural Sector 7, working the same radiation-exposed shifts he'd once endured. Sometimes he met Lyra in the environmental resource management offices, coordinating atmospheric adjustments that served collective survival rather than individual assessment. The time they shared had different quality than their previous interactions. No institutional objectives, no data collection requirements, no assessment protocols. Just presence, conversation, the gradual accumulation of proximity that served nothing except the fact that they wanted it. Dr. Venn showed him her theoretical models, explaining genetic drift patterns in populations that had spent 11 generations under controlled optimization. Her explanations were passionate in ways her research presentations had never been, animated by genuine curiosity rather than institutional obligation. When he asked questions, she answered without the clinical detachment that had characterized their formal proximity studies. One evening, working late in her sector office, she set aside her data tablets and looked at him directly. "I've been mapping genetic diversity loss across the 11 generations since population controls began," she said. "The councils believed optimization would enhance human survival. But every trait they selected against, adaptability, stress resilience, environmental responsiveness, those were the traits that made survival possible outside controlled conditions. They optimized humanity for the system they built," Kyle said. "Exactly." Her eyes held his with intensity he recognized from their informal discussions in the shared quarters. "And then they encountered you, someone whose survival proved their entire framework was built on false assumptions. Someone who thrived precisely because you weren't optimized." She moved closer, her hand finding his with the same natural ease that had developed during their cohabitation research protocol. "The tribunal tried to partition you because they couldn't acknowledge what your survival actually means, that humanity doesn't require their system. That optimization might have been systematic weakening instead of systematic improvement." Kyle felt the weight of her analysis, the implications about institutional frameworks built on assumptions that individual survival could contradict. "What are you going to do with the data?" he asked. "Publish it independently. Circulate it through sectors that question the Council's resource optimization models." She paused, her grip on his hand tightening. "Provide evidence that refusing compliance might be more adaptive than accepting it." The statement carried deliberate meaning. She wasn't just discussing genetic patterns, but modeling a different kind of survival, one based on refusal rather than endurance. Commander Sierra's approach was characteristically physical. During his visits to agricultural Sector 7, she integrated him into her maintenance work, their bodies moving in the same synchronized rhythm they'd developed during survival simulations. But without tactical objectives or performance metrics, the work became something different. Shared labor chosen rather than assigned, physical proximity that served practical function while acknowledging the intimacy that proximity created. After a shift dismantling damaged solar collectors, they sat against the curved dome wall, shoulders touching, both of them overheated and exhausted in ways that felt familiar from their training sessions. But the exhaustion carried different weight now, chosen rather than mandated, serving no institutional objective except the satisfaction of completed work. I spent 17 years optimizing human performance for military objectives, Sira said, her voice quiet in the dome's filtered silence. Followed protocols designed to eliminate inefficiency, maximize utility, treat personnel as tactical assets. She turned her head, looking at him directly. Then you survived 3 years in conditions that proved the protocols were inadequate. That optimization had systematically removed the traits that make humans functional outside controlled environments. Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing with unconscious precision. The tribunal tried to weaponize your survival, turn your adaptation into reproducible training protocols. Extract what made you functional and apply it to populations that had been systematically weakened through genetic optimization. But you resigned instead of participating. I resigned because I finally understood that the system I'd been serving was the problem, not the solution. Her grip tightened, a grip, and because I couldn't keep measuring your survival, while knowing the measurements would be used to justify your systematic reduction to utility. She shifted closer, her other hand moving to his face in a gesture that had become familiar during their encounters after she'd transferred divisions. You taught me that refusal is sometimes the only adaptive response to systems designed to eliminate autonomy. When she kissed him, her body pressing against his with deliberate intent, he felt the difference between contact scheduled by partition protocols and contact chosen despite those protocols. The weight of autonomy claimed rather than granted. Lyra's transformation was the most visible. Her administrative precision had been replaced by something looser, more uncertain but also more genuine. During his visits to the Environmental Resource Management Division, she shared the work she was doing, coordinating atmospheric adjustments, managing resource distribution, maintaining the environmental systems that kept the colonies functional. I spent 3 years believing the Coalition's approach was more ethical than the Council's genetic optimization, she said during one late evening while they reviewed oxygen distribution data. That prioritizing natural adaptation honored human autonomy better than systematic engineering. She paused, her voice carrying the same vulnerable uncertainty he'd heard the night she declined her partition allocation. But natural doesn't mean voluntary when it's mandated by institutional frameworks designed to eliminate actual choice. She turned from the data displays to look at him directly. The Coalition wanted to use your adaptability as foundation for expansion populations, claimed it honored your autonomy because it didn't require genetic modification. But reproduction as institutional mandate isn't autonomy. It's just a different kind of optimization. Kale heard the echo of arguments she'd made during Coalition briefings, now inverted to serve refusal rather than participation. You proved that adaptation without choice is just compliance with better marketing, Lyra continued. That surviving institutional frameworks requires refusing to participate in them, even when participation offers resources and position. Her hand moved to his, their fingers interlacing with the same ease that had developed during their Coalition interactions. I transferred divisions because I couldn't keep coordinating your reproductive partition while knowing it served expansion models that treated you as biological infrastructure. She paused. But I also transferred because I wanted proximity that wasn't scheduled, contact that served nothing except the fact that I wanted it, and you were willing to give it. When she kissed him, her hands moving to his face with familiar tenderness, he recognized the pattern all 3 women were demonstrating. That autonomy sometimes required sacrificing the frameworks designed to grant permission, that some forms of proximity were worth the institutional cost, that refusal could be its own kind of adaptation. The partition schedule eroded further. By the 6th week, Kyle was attending less than 40% of his scheduled obligations, spending the remainder of his time in sectors where the 3 women worked or in his own quarters, refusing to present himself for assessment, even when formal summons arrived through official channels. The institutional response remained documentation without enforcement. Research Division filed increasingly urgent complaints about incomplete data collection. Military training supervisors noted performance gaps due to irregular attendance. Coalition administration compiled reports about reproductive assessment delays reaching critical thresholds. But no one physically compelled his attendance. No one deployed enforcement protocols or initiated corrective measures. The system operated on assumed compliance, and when compliance wasn't voluntary, the system simply documented its absence. Dr. Venn noticed the pattern during one of his visits to her sector office. They're not enforcing the partition, because enforcement would require acknowledging that you're refusing it, she said, her eyes on the formal complaints displayed on her terminal. Acknowledging refusal means acknowledging that the partition was never voluntary, that it was compliance justified through institutional authority rather than genuine consent. So they're waiting for me to comply voluntarily. They're waiting for you to accept that compliance is inevitable. She turned from the terminal to face him fully. But your survival has already proved that their version of inevitable isn't universal, that humans can thrive outside their optimized frameworks. That adaptation might mean refusing the system rather than accepting it. Kyle felt the implication settle, that his continued non-compliance was itself a form of data, evidence that the partition framework was optional rather than mandatory, that institutional authority required voluntary participation to function. What happens when they realize I'm not going to comply? He asked. Dr. Venn's expression shifted, carrying the same complex mixture of concern and certainty he'd seen in Commander Sira and Lyra. They'll try to create conditions that make non-compliance more costly than compliance, threaten resource allocation, position security, residential assignment. She paused. But you've already survived their worst threats. You've already endured conditions they use as punishment. She moved closer, her hands finding his face with deliberate tenderness. They tried to make you expendable 3 years ago. Instead, they proved you're functional in conditions where their optimized populations fail. Now they're trying to make you useful. But you're proving that usefulness is optional when it requires accepting systematic reduction to infrastructure. When she kissed him, her body pressing against his with familiar urgency, he felt the accumulated weight of 6 weeks learning what refusal looked like. Not dramatic rebellion, but quiet, consistent non-compliance, the gradual erosion of institutional authority through individual choice repeated until compliance became obviously voluntary rather than inevitable. Commander Sira and Lyra arrived at Dr. Venn's sector office within minutes of each other, their timing suggesting coordination, though none of them acknowledged it explicitly. The 3 women shared a look that carried complex communication before Sira spoke. The institutional divisions are coordinating a unified response to your non-compliance, she said, her tactical assessment evident in her tone. Research, military, and coalition are filing joint petition for enforcement protocols. They're arguing that your continued refusal threatens critical institutional objectives. When? Kyle asked. Council review is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Lyra's voice carried administrative precision, despite her transfer out of coalition division. They're requesting authorization for involuntary compliance measures, physical escort to scheduled obligations, residential custody during non-allocated time, medical sedation if you resist physically. The 3 women stood in loose formation around him, their presence protective in ways that had nothing to do with institutional frameworks. They're finally acknowledging that the partition requires enforcement, Dr. Venn said quietly, which means acknowledging that it was never voluntary, that the entire framework operates on assumed compliance rather than genuine consent. Kyle looked at the 3 women who had sacrificed institutional position to refuse participation in his partition, who had demonstrated through individual choice that the system's authority was optional when individuals were willing to accept the cost of refusal. What would you do? He asked them. They exchanged another weighted look before Commander Sira answered, with characteristic directness. We'd refuse, she said simply. We'd make them enforce compliance physically, force them to acknowledge that their entire framework requires coercion rather than consent. She paused. But that's our choice. You have to make yours. Kyle measured his breathing in 6-second intervals, feeling the accumulated weight of 6 weeks, learning what autonomy looked like when institutional frameworks withdrew their assumption of voluntary compliance, when refusal became its own kind of survival, and endurance transformed into deliberate choice. He'd spent 3 years surviving conditions designed to break compliance. Now he had to decide whether to survive the system designed to extract everything his survival had proved possible. The council review would convene in 12 hours, and whatever decision he made would determine not just his future, but the fundamental question of whether human autonomy existed within frameworks designed to eliminate it. Chapter 8. Threshold. Kyle didn't attend the council review. The decision was simple once he stopped conceptualizing it as defiance and recognized it as choice, the basic exercise of autonomy that the partition framework had systematically attempted to eliminate. He remained in his quarters during the scheduled review time, his breathing measured, his hands steady, aware that his absence would force the council to make explicit what they'd kept implicit, that compliance wasn't voluntary, that the partition framework required coercion, that institutional authority operated through assumed consent rather than genuine choice. Dr. Venn, Commander Sira, and Lyra arrived at his quarters before the council issued their decision. They entered without announcement, their presence carrying weight that had nothing to do with institutional representation. The council authorized enforcement protocols, Lyra said, her voice carrying administrative precision despite the concern visible in her expression. Security Division has been directed to escort you to scheduled obligations using physical restraint if necessary. Medical Division received authorization to administer compliance sedation if you resist. Kyle absorbed the information without reaction, recognizing it as the logical outcome of systematic non-compliance. The system had exhausted documentation and was escalating to coercion, the only tool remaining when assumed consent failed. "How long before they implement?" he asked. "Security escort has been scheduled to arrive in 40 minutes, Commander Sira said, her tactical assessment evident. "They'll take you directly to Research Division for immediate resumption of proximity studies under involuntary participation protocols." The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality. They were coming to physically compel his attendance, to transform non-compliance into compliance through force. Dr. Venn moved closer, her hands finding his arms with familiar urgency. "You have approximately 40 minutes to decide whether you're going to accept enforcement or resist it." Her eyes searched his face. "If you resist, they'll escalate to medical sedation. If you accept escort, you'll be under continuous custody during all non-allocated time to prevent further non-compliance. Neither option includes autonomy," he said. "No," she agreed quietly. "Neither option allows you to remain yourself while participating in their framework." The statement crystallized what he'd been learning through 6 weeks of gradual non-compliance, that some systems couldn't be reformed through participation, that compliance, even reluctant compliance, validated frameworks designed to eliminate choice, that refusing to participate was sometimes the only way to preserve the self that made participation meaningful. Lyra stepped forward, her administrative composure entirely absent. "There's a third option, one we've been discussing since you started refusing partition obligations." Kyle waited, reading the weight in her expression, the way all 3 women were watching him with identical intensity. "We could leave," Lyra said simply. "Transfer to outer colony settlements, request assignment to territorial expansion sites, remove ourselves entirely from the core colony systems." "They won't authorize departure for someone under enforcement protocols," Kyle said. "They will for us," Commander Sira said, her tactical certainty evident. "We're not under enforcement. We're voluntary transfers who've fulfilled our institutional obligations. We can request frontier assignments without triggering compliance reviews." "And take you with us," Dr. Venn finished. "Not as partition subject or enforcement custody. As autonomous individual choosing departure." The proposal carried implications about collective refusal versus individual non-compliance, about creating alternative existence outside frameworks designed to eliminate autonomy. But it also carried risk. Outer settlements operated with minimal resources. Frontier sites faced conditions that made outer dome maintenance look comfortable. Territorial expansion meant accepting uncertainty that the core colonies had engineered out of existence. "You'd sacrifice position security, resource allocation, environmental stability," Kyle said, testing their certainty. "Everything the core colonies offer in exchange for compliance." "We already sacrificed those things when we transferred divisions," Lyra said. "We declined our partition allocations. We chose individual refusal over institutional authority. This is just the next iteration of the same choice. The difference is that frontier settlements don't have partition frameworks," Dr. Venn added, "don't have reproductive councils or genetic optimization protocols or institutional mandates about how existence should be allocated. They have survival requirements and collective coordination, but not systematic reduction of individuals to utility. They need adaptability, Commander Sira said, her eyes holding his. Need people who can thrive in uncontrolled conditions. Need exactly what you've been proving possible for 3 years. She paused. And they need it as survival capability, not as data to be extracted or genetics to be weaponized. Kyle felt the proposal's weight, the implications about choosing collective departure over individual resistance, about refusing the system entirely rather than resisting within it. "You're asking me to run," he said. "We're asking you to refuse enforcement by removing yourself from its jurisdiction," Dr. Venn corrected. "There's a difference between fleeing punishment and declining participation in frameworks designed to eliminate choice. The Council will interpret it as non-compliance regardless." "Let them," Lyra said with unexpected fierceness. "Let them document that their partition framework required enforcement protocols, that their optimization models produced populations that can't survive outside controlled environments, that the only person who could thrive in frontier conditions refused to participate in their systematic extraction of what made that survival possible." The 3 women moved closer, forming loose circle around him, their presence protective and certain at once. "We're leaving in 30 minutes, Commander Sira said. "Frontier transport departs from outer sector loading docks. We've already filed departure requests citing voluntary transfer to territorial expansion sites. Security Division won't intercept us because we're not under enforcement protocols." "But you could be," Kyle said, "if they determine you're facilitating my non-compliance." "Then they'll have to enforce compliance on all of us," Dr. Venn said quietly. "Have to acknowledge that their entire framework operates through coercion rather than consent. That their optimization produced populations requiring systematic control to maintain function." Kyle looked at the 3 women who had already chosen individual refusal over institutional compliance, who were now offering collective departure as alternative to enforcement, who were willing to accept frontier uncertainty rather than participate in his systematic reduction to infrastructure. "Why?" he asked simply. They exchanged weighted looks before Lyra answered. "Because you proved that humanity doesn't require their system," she said. "Because your survival demonstrated that adaptation might mean refusing frameworks designed to control it. Because we'd rather face frontier conditions with autonomy than accept core colony stability that requires systematic elimination of choice." She paused, her hand finding his with familiar ease. "And because we want proximity that serves nothing except the fact that we want it. Time with you that's chosen rather than allocated. Existence that prioritizes genuine connection over institutional utility." Commander Sira's hand joined Lyra's, her grip firm and certain. "We're not asking you to run from enforcement. We're asking you to choose collective departure over individual resistance, to refuse the system entirely rather than resisting within it." "Doctor." Venn's hands found his face, her touch carrying the same intimate knowledge from their proximity studies, but without the clinical detachment. "We're asking you to trust that survival outside their frameworks is possible, that you've already proved it, that we're willing to prove it with you." When she kissed him, her body pressing against his with familiar urgency, he felt the accumulated weight of choice, not just his own, but theirs, the collective refusal they were offering as alternative to enforcement. 15 minutes, Commander Sira said quietly when Dr. Venn stepped back. "Frontier transport won't delay departure for individual transfers." Kyle measured his breathing in 6-second intervals, feeling the threshold between endurance and refusal, between surviving within the system and choosing to leave it entirely. He'd spent 3 years proving he could thrive in conditions designed to break compliance, 6 weeks proving that non-compliance was sustainable when individuals were willing to accept its cost. Now he had to decide whether to resist enforcement individually or refuse the framework collectively, whether to survive the system through continued resistance or choose departure as final refusal. The 3 women waited, their presence steady, their choice already made. Whatever he decided, they would honor it, support his resistance if he stayed, accompany his departure if he left, refuse to participate in enforcement regardless of his choice. But they wanted him to choose departure, wanted him to trust that survival outside institutional frameworks was possible, that autonomy could exist beyond systems designed to eliminate it, That collective refusal might create space for genuine choice that individual resistance couldn't achieve. He thought about the partition framework, the systematic attempt to extract his survival and transform it into utility, to reduce him from person to infrastructure, to make his existence serve institutional objectives rather than individual autonomy. He thought about enforcement protocols, about physical escort and compliance sedation, about continuous custody designed to prevent non-compliance. He thought about the 3 women who had already chosen departure over participation, who were offering collective refusal as alternative to individual resistance, who had demonstrated through their own choices that institutional authority was optional when individuals were willing to accept the cost of refusing it. "I need to get my things," he said quietly. Relief crossed all 3 faces simultaneously. Dr. Ven's hands tightened on his face before she released him. Commander Syra's grip on his hand shifted to his shoulder, squeeze brief but weighted with tactical approval. Lyra's fingers interlaced with his, her administrative precision finally entirely replaced by genuine emotion. "You don't have time for extensive packing," Syra said, her voice carrying command certainty. "Essentials only. We leave in 12 minutes. Kyle moved through his quarters with practiced efficiency, gathering the minimal possessions that had survived 3 years in outer dome maintenance, a few changes of clothing, personal documentation, the small collection of items he'd accumulated during his environmental calibration work. Everything fit in a single pack, evidence that he'd never really settled into the temporary quarters the research complex had assigned him. The 3 women waited by the door, their own belongings similarly minimal. They'd planned this, he realized, had been coordinating departure logistics during his visits to their respective sectors, had prepared for the possibility that he would choose refusal over resistance. "Ready?" Dr. Venn asked. Kyle shouldered his pack, taking one final look at the neutral quarters that had housed him during 6 weeks of systematic non-compliance. Then he nodded, stepping through the doorway into the corridor where the 3 women waited. They moved through the residential sectors with deliberate casualness, 4 people conducting voluntary transfer rather than fugitives fleeing enforcement. The colony's personnel monitoring systems tracked their movement without flagging irregularities. Transfers happened regularly enough that 4 individuals heading toward outer sector loading docks wouldn't trigger immediate scrutiny. The Frontier transport was smaller than Kale expected, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Its passenger capacity was listed at 30, but only 8 others were boarding, voluntary transfers seeking Frontier opportunities or fleeing core colony constraints. None of them showed interest in the 4 late arrivals, who boarded with minimal possessions and settled into rear passenger compartment. The transport sealed its access hatch exactly on schedule. Through the narrow viewports, Kyle watched the loading dock cycle through departure protocols. The massive airlock doors opening to reveal the transit corridor that connected core colony sectors to Frontier settlements. Dr. Ven's hand found his, her grip tight enough to transmit tension. "No reversing this. Once we're in transit, Security Division won't be able to intercept without Frontier Administration cooperation." "And Frontier Administration doesn't cooperate with core colony enforcement," Lyra added from his other side. "Different jurisdiction, different frameworks, different priorities." Commander Syra sat across from them, her expression carrying tactical satisfaction. "They'll document our departure as facilitated non-compliance. File formal complaints with Frontier Coordination Councils. Demand our return for participation in enforcement proceedings." "But they won't get it," Dr. Venn said with quiet certainty, "because Frontier settlements operate on voluntary cooperation rather than institutional mandate. They don't have frameworks for compelling individuals to return to systems they've chosen to leave." The transport engines engaged, vibration traveling through the hull as the vessel began its departure sequence. Kyle felt the shift in momentum, the physical sensation of leaving core colony jurisdiction, of crossing threshold between resistance and refusal. Through the viewport he watched the core colony sectors recede, the controlled environments, the optimized populations, the institutional frameworks designed to eliminate uncertainty at the cost of eliminating autonomy. He'd spent 3 years proving he could survive their worst punishment, 6 weeks proving that non-compliance was sustainable, and now he was proving that departure was possible, that collective refusal could create alternative existence outside systems designed to make refusal impossible. The 3 women sat close, Dr. Ven's hand in his, Lyra's shoulder pressed against his, Commander Sierra's presence steady across the narrow compartment. They'd all chosen this, had all accepted frontier uncertainty rather than participate in frameworks that required systematic reduction of individuals to utility. The transport cleared core colony jurisdiction 30 minutes into transit. Commander Sierra checked the navigation displays and nodded confirmation. "We're outside enforcement range," she said. "Security Division can file complaints, but can't compel return without Frontier Administration cooperation." Dr. Ven released a breath she'd been holding, her grip on Kyle's hand relaxing slightly. "We did it. We actually refused the entire framework." "We left," Lyra corrected gently. "Refusal will be the work we do in frontier settlements, building existence that prioritizes autonomy over optimization, demonstrating that humans can thrive outside controlled frameworks." She turned to look at Kyle directly. "Proving that your survival wasn't anomaly, but evidence that the core colonies optimized humanity for the wrong conditions." Kyle met her gaze. Then Dr. Ven's, then Commander Sierra's, seeing in all three faces the same complex mixture of certainty and uncertainty, confidence in their choice combined with awareness that frontier existence would require different kind of adaptation than any of them had practiced in core colony sectors. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we survive," Commander Sierra said simply. "We adapt to conditions that weren't optimized for human comfort. We build existence based on genuine cooperation rather than institutional mandate. We prove that autonomy is sustainable outside frameworks designed to eliminate it." She leaned forward, her eyes holding his with tactical intensity. "And we do it together, not as partition subjects or institutional representatives, as four people who chose collective departure over individual compliance." Dr. Ven's other hand found his face, her touch carrying the same intimate knowledge from their proximity studies. "We chose this, chose you, chose refusal over participation. Now we get to discover what existence looks like when it's not allocated by systems designed to extract utility." When she kissed him, her body pressing against his in the narrow passenger compartment, he felt the accumulated weight of threshold crossed, not just physical departure from core colony jurisdiction, but fundamental shift from endurance to choice, from compliance to refusal, from individual resistance to collective autonomy. Lyra's hand joined Dr. Ven's on his face, her touch gentle but certain. Commander Sierra moved to sit beside them, her presence completing the circle of proximity they'd been building through 6 weeks of systematic non-compliance. "We're going to make this work," Lyra said quietly. "We're going to prove that your survival wasn't an anomaly that needed institutional extraction, that humanity doesn't require optimization frameworks, that autonomy is possible when individuals are willing to accept its costs." The transport engines maintained steady rhythm, carrying them further from core colony control with each passing minute. Through the viewport, Kyle watched Frontier approach, uncertain, uncontrolled, requiring adaptation rather than compliance. He'd spent 3 years surviving punishment designed to break him, 6 weeks learning what refusal looked like. And now he was beginning to understand what autonomy might require. Not just individual non-compliance, but collective departure. Not just resistance within systems, but creation of existence outside them. The 3 women who had chosen this with him sat close, their presence steady and certain. Whatever Frontier brought, they would face it together. Not as institutional representatives managing partition obligations, but as 4 people who had proven that refusing impossible choices was itself a choice, that survival sometimes required leaving systems designed to control it. The legend the core colonies had tried to create from his survival had grown beyond any truth he could embody within their frameworks. But out here, beyond institutional jurisdiction, maybe he could become something different. Not legend or infrastructure or solution, but simply human, choosing existence on his own terms with people who valued autonomy enough to sacrifice optimization for it. The transport carried them forward, and Kale measured his breathing not in controlled intervals, but in the natural rhythm of someone breathing freely, choosing each breath rather than regulating it, surviving not because systems required it, but because life was worth living when it belonged to the person living it.